Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Rachel Kerrigan, and I'm delighted that Dr. Compton has asked me to come and speak with you for just a few minutes about disaster recovery in Rwanda. So we're going to address a little bit of cultural competency and also look at a recovery model on a community level. A lot of times we think about trauma recovery or disaster recovery for individuals, but we're going to look at community recovery and use Rwanda, where I lived for 4 years, as an example. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint here, and we'll get started. So just quickly, some learning objectives, talking again about community recovery. We're going to identify how traumatic grief recovery can happen on a community level, and again, look at Rwanda as an example in 3 ways to see how they have implemented opportunities to promote recovery after the genocide that occurred there in 1994. We'll also talk a little bit about hope in communal recovery and the importance of that virtue, and look at cultural competency in disaster. So here are just some photos of Rwanda and thinking about why is Rwanda relevant to disaster response? Well, many of you may know that in 1994, there was a genocide there. And so we're going to address that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics there, but also currently there are some things that make Rwanda more vulnerable than other places that we'll talk about. So just a few pictures here that if you go into the countryside of Rwanda, the bigger picture here on the bottom right is what you'll largely see. It's known as the land of 1,000 hills, and you can see why. There's rolling hill after rolling hill. And the convention center is kind of a centerpiece in Kigali. So this is the main the main hub in the capital, and a beautiful building that was constructed, and it is a beautiful place to spend time where many meetings and important events are held. On the upper left, you see 2 women walking. This is just a typical view you will see, especially on a Sunday afternoon when I took this picture. These women are likely headed to a lunch after church, and they have probably food in their baskets. That's how they bring gifts, is through these handmade baskets, the grass baskets that often the women make. It may carry things like bananas or potatoes. That's a really kind gift to share when you're going to have a meal with someone. So just as a reminder for those of you who may not be aware, in 1994, Rwanda, which is this tiny country here with the arrow, you can see it's about the size of Delaware, I believe. It's a tiny little country in the middle of Africa, on the eastern middle half of Africa, surrounded by Burundi and Tanzania and Uganda and the DRC, Congo. And so it's a little tiny country, but in 1994, a tragedy hit this country when for 3 months, 1 million people lost their lives, nearly 1 million people, and 77% of these individuals were of Tutsi origin. So this is a group within Rwanda, one of the 3 main tribes, and 77% of those killed, of the 1 million people, were from this group. So it was an attempt to wipe out an entire group of people within this country. And so if you think about this, it's about 10,000 people per day who were killed. And during this time of year, particularly in April, May, and June, the country mourns at remembering this horrible, horrible time. There are parades and memorials that are going on throughout this time, and reminders of to be quiet and to mourn. So this is a particularly important time during the year, now almost 29 years ago that this occurred. Of course, people, even who have not experienced the genocide, are raised with people who have this background and hear about the trauma and are reminded of the trauma. Another key element that is important to keep in mind, that there was largely silence from the global community during this time. What I want to talk to you today about is the recovery that I witnessed when I was there, and that is evident to the world. It has been it's been a place that is marked as have many successes since this horrible tragedy that happened in the mid-90s. Since 2006, mortality is halved. The average lifespan has nearly doubled, and this was back in 2016. So I'm guessing these numbers could be updated to even better. But from 35 in 96 to 67 in 2016, you see more and more medical facilities and better care and nutrition in the country that can help, and prenatal care and things like that contribute to these rising numbers in lifespan. It's also one of the cleanest and safest countries in the world. When we moved there, my kids were quite little, and they would remark at how clean it was. They have a culture of not allowing garbage. They don't allow plastic bags or other pieces of garbage. People tend to pick it up and throw it away. And they even have some things we'll talk about that help facilitate cleanliness. And in terms of safety, I can just attest feeling very safe. There were not a lot of concerns while we were there. We let our kids walk to their friends' houses in the neighborhood and things like that. Didn't worry about being out past dark. Again, it was a safe country. The president, Kagame, boasts that no major killings have occurred since '95, which is quite impressive. Of course, that year after the genocide, there were still some uprising and things that happened. Rwanda does have a goal to become a middle-income country by 2030. They are on their way. My husband is there now, celebrating some achievements with his company of bringing clean water to people. They're just allowing for a lot of development to occur. Strength within community. So the core experiences, according to Judith Herman in her book, Trauma and Recovery back in '97, which really, if you haven't read that book, that's a great book that kind of led the way in terms of how we think about trauma treatment in kind of the modern, more current era. And she says that the core experience of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Recovery, therefore, is based upon empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of human relationships, It cannot occur in isolation. And so she points to the importance of the relational factor. And I think this is particularly important when thinking about recovery on a community level. There's a lot of evidence that points to strong community being a protective factor in recovering from collective trauma. So again, community and relationships are key in recovery. And then finally, Landu says strong connections within the family, community, and social networks can help prevent long-term mental health difficulties. So both in the immediate recovery, but also long-term. And Walsh and McGoldrick point to 4 tasks. So this is the model we're going to look at. They have Walsh has a couple articles about community recovery. And in this one, they specifically note 4 tasks in adapting to traumatic loss in a community. First is shared acknowledgement of the reality of traumatic loss, of the event, losses, and clarification of facts. So, and this piece is pointing to this, to the importance of addressing how exactly what happened, an agreement on that there was an event or was traumatic loss, and some clarity about the narrative, about what has happened, that the community shares. Secondly, shared experience of loss and survivorship. So this points to this shared reality that life has changed, both in relation, and this could be relationally, physically, reminders that might be around in the community that something has occurred, loss has occurred. In addition, shared experience of survivorship. So people who have survived traumatic loss have this in common, that they together have survived when maybe others around them have not. Thirdly, reorganization of family and community after loss. There needs to be some sort of organized recognition that there needs to be reorganization, and then achieving that through some way of reorganizing community after the event or after the traumatic loss has happened. Based on the traumatic loss, even what have we learned? So reorganization, and then finally reinvestment in relationships and life pursuits. So that hope, that piece of hope is so important, of reinvesting, of saying, I'm going to try again. I'm not giving up, but together we are reinvesting in life and the world around us. So I'm just going to take a few examples from Rwanda's history, from their recovery, and point to possibilities that may that I'm sure were not intentional, but signify ways that Rwanda has implemented and shows that this model can be effective. Right, I'm not saying that they were trying to follow the model, but just some examples that might point to, wow, yes, this does reflect what the model is saying. So first, acknowledgement and clarification of facts. One example of this in Rwanda is the Gacaca courts. 1.9 million cases between 2002 and 2012. What happened here is, after the genocide, those who were arrested, who committed atrocities and committed violence and killings and engaged in that, were arrested largely and put into prison. Those who didn't leave the country or who didn't lose their lives themselves, they were often put in prison. And when they served their sentence, before they were released completely, they were required to go in front of the community that where they committed the atrocities, where they hurt those around them. And they were required to have this ceremony of exactly this, acknowledgement and clarification of what happened, a recognition they committed atrocities, and permission to re-enter the community after this ceremony. In terms of shared experience, one example that I saw happening is just all of the parades and memorials around this time of year on April 6th. That notes the beginning of the genocide, and there is a large parade in Kigali. This is right near where we lived, where people walk and remember in recognition that the genocide happened. They don't want to forget. They don't want to wash it over and say it never happened, but to recognize the shared experience and together remembering it as a community, as a group. Additionally, they have memorials all over the country that, again, people visit in solidarity and come together. They're all over the country, but probably the most notable one is right there in Kigali. If you ever visit, I certainly recommend that you see it. It's another example of clarification of facts too. They lay out all the facts and have the visitors read through them, and then have reminders of people who lost their lives. And then this is one example that might be an example for both reorganization and reinvestment. One of the ways that Rwanda has recovered and rebuilt their country is this tradition of Umuganda. And this is a required event that happens on the last Saturday of every month in the morning time. All businesses are closed, and all Rwandan citizens are required to go out, excuse me, into their neighborhood and together work on a project, a community building project. So this can be anything from picking up trash to repairing a wall or a water. Maybe this is, I'm not exactly sure here, but they're working on some project to improve their community. And it's just a really neat thing to see. All the streets are closed, all the businesses are closed, and everyone comes out of their house, and all able bodies engage in some kind of productive work towards building and reorganizing the community that they live in. And so this is another example of community investment and recovery. One time when we were there, we helped build a animal shelter for large animals out in the rural area for, I think it was for cows and goats and sheep and that kind of a thing. So just being able to participate in things like that was really powerful to see that kind of work, and how life just stops. Everything, the focus is less on getting to your job or even getting your groceries or whatever. The focus is really on rebuilding the community. So quickly thinking about how Rwanda is vulnerable today, just noting that everything isn't perfect. There's still concerns and things that Rwanda faces, and not always adequate disaster response plans. I know perhaps you're thinking about disaster relief and response, and those are fewer in developing countries. They're less developed often. So some of the ways that Rwanda is vulnerable include landslides or flash floods. There are often, when the rain comes, it rains really hard. And so I live in the Seattle area now, and there's like a trickling all the time. And maybe those of you in Virginia have a little bit more of this experience where when the clouds come, they come hard and fast and the water pours. Well, that's the case in Rwanda. You have these loud, exciting storms, but the result can be flash floods because there isn't adequate drainage, and because of the mountains, there's deep valleys that they can get flooded. In fact, now they've outlawed people building houses down there for just that reason, because they kept getting washed out. Refugees. So Rwanda has some vulnerable borders. Congo and Burundi, even the other countries, Tanzania and Uganda, have sent refugees at different times. Rwanda admits that they themselves have been refugees, and they want to be a place where they can house refugees. And so they do. The border to Congo, for example, continually has refugees coming over, and Rwanda has accepted those refugees and makes place for them. Political stability is always an ongoing concern and a thing that needs attention. So a country that has undergone the kind of wars recently that they have, political stability is even more pertinent than sometimes we feel here, because the effects of instability are quite tangible. Border security, keeping the border secure, and between, again, countries that are sometimes not 100% stable. And then pandemics, when we were there, of course, COVID hit. Also, Ebola was a concern at one point. We had protocols for Ebola evacuations. And Rwanda was quite prepared. When COVID hit, the country really shut down. They really practiced social distancing and masking, all those things, sometimes to the detriment of being able for farmers to get their food and stuff. And so there was always this tension of how do we protect while also being, allowing people to get the food that they need in a country where people sometimes only have enough food for that day. Having a lockdown is a bit more challenging. So figuring out all those pieces, it was something we saw the country navigate. I wanted to quickly highlight America's role in terms of the American Embassy. I think it was interesting for me to be able to interact with some of the diplomats there and hear their stories about disaster relief, and how much energy and planning goes into disaster response from an American Embassy perspective. And not that they are alone in creating disaster relief, certainly not. They work with all kinds of organizations that also are in Rwanda, both the Rwandan government, but also other governments from around the world, and NGOs, nonprofit agencies, that are there. They put a lot of focus on how to help Rwanda respond well to disasters. So, for example, the Regional Security Office within the U.S. Embassy manages a chain of command for emergency preparedness. And there are literally hundreds of scenarios where they have detailed procedures outlined to respond to emergencies, both for the U.S. Embassy itself, but also to help the country at large. For example, they do mock emergencies also 2 times a year. So they bring in other embassies and individuals from the Rwandan government, partners and organizations, schools, and they run mock emergencies and say, okay, if this happened, if there was an earthquake, if there was a invasion, what are the steps we would take? What is the chain of command? What is what are the procedures that we need to follow? And I remember being thankful when I learned about this, that I could live and operate there without daily thinking about disaster preparedness. I really felt, like I said, quite safe, and felt glad that there were others thinking so carefully about how to respond to an emergency. And that's certainly true in the US as well. And then I want to talk quickly about this construct of hope in mental health. I think in terms of disaster recovery, having a hope for the future is so important, a hope that things can get better. And thinking about ways to help facilitate hope is essential, I think, as a mental health provider. Hope is a construct in mental health that includes agency, goal-directed energy, pathways, plans to meet goals, and we can help facilitate that by the questions we ask, by things like having disaster plans. We can actually help to facilitate that growth. Hope, as you know, is also a virtue in faith traditions that includes expectation and trust in God for our meaning and purpose, our knowledge that we are pursuing God's kingdom as our ultimate desire, and have this hope for heaven, hope for what God has, the good that God has planned in store. And hope is also connected. Terry Watson, in her book on supervision, connects it with the ethical principle of beneficence, something that we are called to as counselors to work within this for beneficence, for the good, promoting health and well-being in society. So 3 ways I'm going to talk about knowledge, skills, and attitudes that we can have in cultivating cultural competency, responding in a culturally competent way to disaster. Culture shapes the way that you as a person react and respond to disasters at every phase. So history, traditions, values, worldviews color our understanding and perceptions. And of course, culture is so important to keep in mind when you are working in a new context. Whether that's in the US or, if you go help in a disaster relief in another part of the country you're not familiar with, or really in any situation, cultural competency is always so important that you do things like pause and observe, learn, ask questions about the people who have been impacted by a disaster. So you can think about some of these questions I've put here, but culture is just such an important piece to keep in mind. One thing that is really obvious when you are working internationally is a concept of time, that in America we're very aware of time. Even now I'm thinking, oh, my time is limited. I need to wrap up and stop talking to you all. And in Rwanda, for example, it wasn't such the focus. There were other focuses that were more important, things like stopping and talking to people and greeting people properly and being in the moment with them. So the balance of those things culturally is quite important to understand and seek knowledge about. Similarly, with skills, I've highlighted 3 things: building relationships. So with local partners and communities. So you don't want to operate independently when you go into a new culture. You need to learn from those who are working there and build relationships with the people there. And be quiet and learn first before speaking. Second, sending and receiving accurate and appropriate verbal and nonverbal cues. It's really hard to read people's verbal cues if they are coming from a very different place than you. Even things like head nods, or things like eye contact or nods, or touching, things like that can be very, very different person to person, culture to culture. And finally, using time and space appropriately, like I spoke about. Excuse me. This is just a list of some attitudes that are important to cultivate, again, when working cross-culturally. Um, Especially, I'll highlight this relationship between power and compassion and empathy. It's really important when you are learning about another culture. I thought I had my email here listed, but it looks like I do not. So I will go ahead. Um, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I will send you my email to Dr. Compton. And if you have any follow-up questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll send the PowerPoint slides as well. But I really enjoyed talking to you today. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great class.